What if I told you there was an affordable housing solution hidden in plain sight?
You don't believe me.
Cities like Boston, San Francisco, Chicago used to build these homes, but then they were forgotten. It's called missing middle housing, and it could be the key to our current housing crisis. Homes like quadplexes, triplexes, multi-unit buildings, and even ADUs should be built. But will they?
The term missing middle housing really didn't exist in, for example, the 80s. In the 80s, people had starter homes, and starter homes was defined as basically 1,400 square feet and less, usually a 2-bedroom. In Chicago, particularly 1 bath, but probably 1.5 to 2 baths in other cities. And that percentage of starter homes back in the 80s accounted for 40% of housing stock. Fast forward to today, that number is only 9%. So what's going to fill that void between your condos and apartments on one hand, and of course the single family homes on the other hand? It's the missing middle housing. So why then did starter homes basically disappear? So the cynic in me would say profits over people.
They're so greedy.
Developers, looking at their bottom line, focused more on high-end single-family homes and luxury apartments. And so as a result, that starter home vanished. It's not really profitable, even though it's really helping that young couple or that single professional get home ownership. It just wasn't making them any money. So, but of course, this isn't just a supply problem. We're leading on to our next topic here is of zoning, right? That is being restrictive and not getting missing middle housing onto the market. So it's not just a supply problem, but it's also a zoning problem.
Zoning laws are set at the local level. These laws can determine the size of each lot in a neighborhood. They can also specify how far a structure is set back from the property line, how tall it is, or how many units are on site.
Basically, 75% of American land is zoned for single family. That is residential, of course, right? There are commercial land uses, but residential land use, 75%, was used for single family zoning. And so developers were incentivized basically with city credits to start building those single family homes along with making more money. So they really just made it cost prohibitive for developers. So it's basically on one hand, yes, greedy developers, but also the city didn't help. The city didn't encourage. They weren't really thinking about how this more density housing can not only just be eventually be a good financial benefit, but more of a equity benefit. They really ain't thinking about that. So all these years, it's basically city in one hand and the developers on the other hand, building all these single family zoning. Now, at one time in cities like Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, of course, my town, we have a lot of these 2 flats, a type of missing middle housing, 2 to 4 flats. So basically, owners would own the building, they would live in one unit and then rent out the other unit, right, to cover their mortgage. Of course, now, that was in the past. They stopped building those type of homes. So what happens, right? Supply is minimized. Demand is continue to go up because people want to buy homes. And of course, as everyone's seeing now with the housing market, the home prices are astronomical. So actually, even if people wanted to buy a 2 to 4, and 4 flats, folks, simply means 4 units, right? Owners living in one, or maybe renting out all 4, and then of course, using the other 3 to cover the mortgage. They can't afford the homes. The homes are, like for example, in like a Wicker Park neighborhood, you're talking $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. When in the past, if they continued to build the homes, that same home probably could have been in the 400 or 500. I'm estimating here. But as a result of not building those, costs increase, and so now they're going to have to really exponentially increase the supply of these type of 2 flats, or in Boston, it's called a triple decker. That's simply just 3 units. There's actually a stat here in Boston. There were triple deckers or 3 flat homes here in Chicago were banned. And these, again, very similar to what happened in Chicago. These are working class families buying the building and renting out the other 2 units. So it's this really, really flawed logic that these cities used, going hand in hand with developers. and really stifling supply, which of course is causing a lot what we're seeing here in this housing crisis. So it's one thing to, cities are finally waking up, right? Because us, the people, we the people, right, are demanding it. We need this density. And so there are city councils. So to give them credit, there are city councils such as many in California. I'm going to highlight California, Cambridge, which is outside of Boston, and Boise of all, which is very low density on a per capita basis. Those are three cities and states. In California, for example, the city council, in essence, ended single family zoning, right? And so, the law allowed up to 4 units on the lot. So you mentioned ADUs in the beginning of the video. This is accessory dwelling units. So you would think, well, it's just a singular unit, right? Because missing middle, kind of the common theme, is multi-units. However, you already have a single family home there. So what you can conceivably do with these very large lots, based upon what California law said, you can have up to 4 units on a lot. So think about it. You have your single family. Of course, a lot of them have these McMansions. You throw an accessory ADU, which here in Chicago, we have like a coach house. And then you can think about putting a tiny home, right? So let's say there's a single individual that doesn't need a lot of space. They can live in the tiny home. You can have that coach house, and you can have this. So that's 3 units of the 4, which is legally allowed. 3 units versus just having 1. So that's density right there. Of course, now, based upon some of the information I have here, you have 39 million people in California and only 53 projects. Now, I'm going to have to look for more recent data. I had a little issues finding that. So correct me, folks, in the comments if you have some more updated info. 53 projects were only approved for all those amount of people. This is back in legislation back in 2022. Cambridge, in February, just this past February 2025, they ended single-family homes, and they're allowing buildings to 4 stories without special authorization, up to 6 stories on larger lots. So that's where that density is coming, right? The problem is I don't have a lot of data of how much has actually been built. And finally, Boise had, the roadblocks are all the same, folks. It's community resistance, NIMBY, not in my backyard, right? People want to protect their values, and I understand that. I'm a realtor. But there's going to have to be a point where we have to start thinking about housing more as a right versus an investment. And guys are going to go at me, and this is coming from a realtor. We're going to have to find that balance. Maybe not at the extreme of what Japanese housing market, which they don't live in a home for more than several years. They don't look at their home as an investment. We're not going to get to that point, but we're going to have some type of balance. So those are the type of roadblocks. You have financial barriers, you have special interests, and of course, all these requirements, minimum parking requirements, right? Minimum height requirements, which, why is that even there? That are stifling adding that density in this missing middle housing. And I mentioned Boise. Finally, Boise in 2023, they unanimously approved zoning code rewrites permitting duplexes. Duplexes are 2 units. In Chicago, they're multi-level within the single, but the more common definition of duplexes is just 2 units. 2 units on a property. Cottage homes, of course, but they have the same roadblocks. So that's the challenges that we have to overcome. Going a little bit further on the roadblocks, their costs. And of course, right, we all want to demonize developers, but if we can somehow lower those costs that the city imposes, right, not just the construction costs, but just the permit costs, along with the large developers, you can get the small developers in there. So what happens, right, just like with housing, more housing, right, helps reduce eventually in the longer term the pricing. Well, that can reduce the costs to get more housing in there. You just don't have the 1 or 2 big players. You have big players with smaller developers, and that's just more competition helping reduce costs. Now, of course, it doesn't help that the Trump administration with their tariffs, maybe in the long term that ends up being great for our economy, but in the short term, what happens to construction costs? They increase. So they have a higher construction costs, permit costs. But let's see, we want to kind of have some positive elements here. What cities are doing it right or close to doing it right? And so what I have here is Portland, right? Portland's always been a progressive city. They had the residential infill project, which had over 1,400 new units being built since 2020. Austin, right? Austin ended single-family zoning. All right, I know, a little dramatic with the record scratch. Not quite. They originally had that, but actually the new wording is City Council approves smaller lots. So what's happening is you have these McMansions on these huge lots, taking huge amount of land, right? So you have 4 or 5 McMansions where you could technically maybe have twice as many homes in that same amount of land. So they're reducing the lot sizes so people don't build that big. And also they're considering density option. Austin is rapidly growing. I'm really excited about, they have a new light rail that's going to be coming in. So kind of similar to other big cities like Chicago and New York and Boston, building that density around the transit, right? But that has to go hand in hand with not having a parking requirement because it just defeats the purpose. You have the transit there so to reduce the traffic congestion and the car pollution, etc., that's associated with the car. But then you also have a parking requirement there. So what they need to do is have the light rail, have the density around that transit, and not have any mandatory parking requirements. So then people don't need a car, right? Because what happens when you have people, you have the transit, what follows? Grocery stores, and by the way, a lot of these density projects should have, if they're like, more than 5 or 6 stories or higher, they have ground floor. What do they have on the ground floor? Commercial. So you have your grocery store on the ground floor. You live in the building, kind of what I've had all my life. I have the grocery store either in my building, right down the street. I have my bars, I have my restaurants. I live there. I travel to work using the rail. It's a great combination. Probably one of the more groundbreaking approaches in the nation is Minneapolis. I mean, Minneapolis has always been proactive. They've got great transit for the weather. I mean, great transit. Probably going to do part of my urban relocation playlist. I will handle Minneapolis. But in 2020, they essentially also, similar to Austin, ended single-family zoning. Of course, that caused an uproar. And anyone before then would be grandfathered in, but this is going forward. Environmental groups said because of the density, tried to hide behind the fact what they thought that pollution, and I guess of course there would be more water used with the density, but I don't. Weren't able to do any type of causation. It was basically correlation. So. What had happened was they had the environmental concerns, several groups. So there was an injunction by a lower court judge that stopped this plan, what Minneapolis called 2040 plan, right, to bring density. This would be in the form of duplexes and what they called quadplexes or fourplexes into the new lots, along with more apartments. So there would be some high rises, right? So the combination of all three, primarily focused on the duplexes and the quadplexes. Which would address a lot of the inequities that, particularly on the racial lines, that's happened in Minneapolis, and of course it's happening in a lot of cities. The lower court judge granted the injunction, but just this past August, thankfully, Minnesota Supreme Court shot that down, and so this 2040 plan will move forward. So, of course, with the ultimate result, lot of supply. Will that impact the environment? Of course, there's going to be some impact to the environment, but I believe these environmental groups are just overdoing it a bit. So that plan to move forward, probably one of the most aggressive plans, and I'm hoping as this continues that other cities will adopt Minneapolis's plan. So what have we really learned? We're really learning is there's 3 things here that I want you to kind of get your head around. We have to reduce the development fees. We have to reduce the parking requirements, and we have to provide some financial incentives. We have to, right? Developers have to have some incentives if their profits are going to eat. And I know me and you don't care about their profits, but if they don't have profits, they're not going to be building. So those 3 things need to be focused on in order to bring more of this middle missing middle housing to the market, and therefore eventually this is all going to be more of a longer term because we've waited so long, bringing down home prices and providing you the dream of home ownership.